Welcome back to Global Lens. Russia continues to attack Ukraine with no end to the three-year-long war in sight. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy joined 30 global leaders in Paris for Coalition of the Willing Summit, hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron. The talks focused on a plan for long-term security guarantees for Ukraine that is vital to deter further Russian aggression. Zelenskyy said that the leaders agreed that Russia is making every effort to drag out the negotiation process and prolong the war. The leaders also spoke to US President Donald Trump. Macron said Trump has agreed to join the coalition in taking action if Russia refuses further peace efforts. Trump reportedly also said that Europe must stop purchasing Russian oil. After his visit to China, Russian President Vladimir Putin insisted that any peace talks with Zelenskyy must be held in Moscow. However, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha called Putin's offer unacceptable and said that at least 7 neutral countries, including Austria, the Vatican, Switzerland and several Gulf states have offered to host talks. He stressed that Zelenskyy is ready to meet at any time. Meanwhile, Trump recently lashed out at a Polish journalist in the Oval Office who asked why he had not acted against Putin. Trump dismissed the question, citing that secondary tariffs on India was an action against Russia. He told the reporter to get a new job. We're now joined by Michael Kimmage, director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. He recently wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine titled The Pernicious Spectacle of Trump's Russia-Ukraine Diplomacy. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. Where do you think we are with the Russia-Ukraine war at present? Putin has scoffed at the idea of any security guarantees being provided to Ukraine. What's your sense on the road ahead?
Well, the war itself is not changing all that much. Russia has taken modest amounts of territory in Ukraine over the last 12 months, over the last 18 months, and that continues to be a trend, but it doesn't make a difference for the war itself. And it's very, very far from any kind of resolution. So the key point, I think, to regard at the moment is just the military situation, which is completely unresolved. And the diplomacy is ongoing. And happening in Paris and in China, perhaps, and in Washington and elsewhere. But the diplomacy is almost a footnote to the battlefield situation. It seems very difficult for any leader at the moment, whether Putin, Trump, or Zelenskyy, to link some kind of desirable diplomatic outcome to the stalemated war on the ground.
You know, the US president has said something is going to happen, but they're not ready as yet. We're going to get it done. Do you feel that we are looking at some sort of breakthrough in the Russia-Ukraine war?
No. It's very difficult to see what President Trump's agenda is in terms of resolving the war. It's very difficult to believe that he has true leverage over Ukraine and that he has a high degree of trust in Europe in terms of what he might do to end the war. And it's also very difficult to imagine that President Trump would be willing or would be able to deliver to Russia and to President Putin the demands that Russia seems to be making to end the war, which is at the very least Ukraine's neutrality and perhaps some form of Russian control over Ukraine. So, President Trump promises these things. He's promised breakthroughs really since becoming president in his second term in January of this year, and so far has delivered nothing. That could change. It's not impossible that he could deliver something, but it seems to me at the moment highly, highly unlikely.
Right, that's an important point. Let me also ask you about the meeting taking place in Europe between Ukraine, European leaders, chiefs of the European Union and European Commission. What do you think this meeting could actually lead to, Michael?
Well, I think that what it demonstrates is something meaningful, which is that Ukraine is increasingly integrated into European conversations about security. Zelenskyy is a constant presence throughout Europe, and that matters for Ukraine. What Zelenskyy is trying to chart for his country is a European course, and I think he's achieving real degrees of success with that project. On the other hand, and this is the difficult part of the story for Ukraine, Europe speaks about security guarantees. They're vague, they're rather hypothetical. A lot of them seem to materialize after the war has been fought, which is perhaps very far in the future. And what Europe is unable to get from President Trump is a firm commitment to back Europe's security guarantees. Sometimes Trump says he's willing to do security guarantees, but then there's no follow through, and there doesn't seem to be much of a foundation behind those statements of President Trump. So Ukraine is stuck in a holding pattern where it's waiting for security guarantees. The Europeans are not able to deliver completely on their own, and the United States is distancing itself in many ways from its commitments to Ukraine. So as Ukraine achieves real integration into Europe, it doesn't seem to make much progress on the question of security guarantees.
And any security guarantees will not be acceptable to Putin. He's even gone on to say that I can end this war by force also if I want to. Do you think we could possibly see an alliance between Europe and US now?
In terms of close cooperation on Ukraine, I think it's difficult. It's difficult because Trump changes his position monthly and sometimes weekly. So at times, President Trump has called for a ceasefire that we saw before the Alaska summit meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. At times, he calls for a comprehensive solution to the war, and that's a very different demand from a ceasefire. And at times, it seems that President Trump and especially Vice President Vance just want to wash their hands of the whole thing and walk away, if not from Europe writ large, to walk away from Ukraine. So I think it makes it very difficult for Europe to cooperate in some fundamental, lasting, enduring way with the United States. It's not as if Trump's America and Europe are completely at odds with each other when it comes to the war. They are still partnering in support of Ukraine, but there are a lot of limits to those partnerships, and the limits come really from the way that the Trump White House is conducting its business on Ukraine.
Right. Just to ask you about the role of India. United States is putting pressure on India. India is becoming collateral damage in the Russia-Ukraine war. But does India really have any leverage over Russia by penalizing India in this manner? Is Trump gaining any success, any ground with Russia at all?
It's frankly bizarre, I have to say, my personal subjective opinion in terms of the pressure that the Trump administration is putting on India. Not that one can't. I mean, it's a conceivable approach. And of course, India does purchase gas and oil from Russia. But if the U.S. were serious about solving the problem of the war this way, the country to put pressure on is China, not India. China, after all, is a fundamentally important market for Russia. China is providing certain kinds of material that Russia is using to fight the war, and China is just more involved, I would say, in the whole question of the war than India is. So if there's a road that leads to the resolution of the war, that's not a road through Europe, I think it's China that would be the country that matters. So it's just perplexing to me that India has fallen into the crosshairs of the White House in this regard, and I frankly don't see it bringing the war any closer to a conclusion. And as you say, collateral damage, it's brought about a lot of friction between New Delhi and Washington, and it's hard to see how Washington is going to overcome that.
Right. At this stage, it seems that Donald Trump is looking for some sort of exit out of the Russia-Ukraine war. He wanted to end it at the beginning of his administration. This was his goal. He's not been able to achieve that. At what point do you think Trump would walk away, and how much is he going to pursue this? Because some analysts are saying it's possible that the Russia-Ukraine war may never really get completely over. It may go on beyond 2030.
I think that's very possible that the war will be hard to resolve in the short to medium term in the next couple of years. And that's not really a point about the United States. It's much more about the battlefield situation between Russia and Ukraine. What Trump cannot control is the commitment of Europe to Ukraine, which is increasing. So Europe is investing more in Ukraine's capacity to defend itself. As I mentioned earlier, Europe is integrating Ukraine into some of its own structures, and that is going to allow Ukraine to pursue its security interests over the long term. And in a way, Trump can serve as an intermediary. He can have conversations. He can get the ball rolling diplomatically, which he has done since becoming president in January 2025. But he can't really resolve this war on his terms. Whether he would increase the U.S. commitment to Ukraine or whether he would walk away, it's still largely going to be the same war. So I don't quite understand why Trump has inserted himself so dramatically into this process. He's not really able to serve as the fundamental peacemaker in this situation. And in that sense, I think what Trump is doing is just making the United States less and less of a meaningful factor in the war. That's not his goal. His goal is almost the opposite, but it does seem to be the outcome of how he does business on Ukraine.
Right. I just want to ask you about a development that's just taken place. We've seen a conversation between the Indian External Affairs Minister and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister this evening. They discussed bilateral cooperation as well as the Ukraine conflict. India supports an early end to this conflict and the establishment of an enduring peace. Earlier today, Prime Minister Modi also spoke to the leaders of the European Union. Ukraine was predominantly discussed there. What role do you think India can play in ending this? We know that we probably have limited leverage, but considering the kind of pressure now that is being put on India, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister of India are talking to world leaders. They're speaking to countries like Finland, to countries in Europe, Germany, to see if there can be a way out.
Right. I think from a Ukrainian perspective, there's a ongoing search for what you could describe as an honest broker in ending the conflict. And Europe can't really play that role, nor can the United States, because Europe and the United States are militarily a part of the conflict. They're providing aid and assistance to Ukraine. So they're on one side of the war. An honest broker for Ukraine outside of Europe and the United States might be China, but China is very strongly on Russia's side. As I mentioned earlier, China is providing material to Russia to fight the war. So China doesn't really work. I think India works much better. I don't know if this is India's aspiration to play this role. It seems to be part of the Indian story to serve as a peacemaker. And I think India is better situated than the United States, Europe, and China to be a kind of intermediary, to have an open line to Moscow and to speak to President Putin, which is very possible, perhaps even easy for India to have an open line, as you note, to Kyiv. And of course, although there's friction between India and the United States, there are lots of ways that India and the United States could cooperate on war termination and finding a diplomatic path forward. So I do think that India is well positioned, perhaps better than any country I can think of. Maybe India or Turkey are the two countries that are positioned to be intermediaries in this conflict, and it won't be China, and it won't be Europe, and it won't be the United States. It's not an easy job for any country. It's not an easy job for India to play that role, but the possibility is there.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining us for that wonderful conversation. We're looking at very difficult times, and it's in India's interest that the war comes to an end as well. Hope to have you on Global Lens again soon. With that, it's a wrap. This edition